My name is Christopher Fee. My pronouns are they, she, and he, and I am a volunteer with UPlift Black and the coordinator for UPlift Proud. UPlift Black is rooted in 2S LGBTQIA+ inclusivity, and as such, we are working to help to uplift queer voices within the broader community, as well as within the Black community specifically. We are working to ensure that everyone shares power in space. UPlift believes that diverse communities thrive. They are places where everyone is honored, has dignity, and is able to be their authentic selves without persecution. This Pride Month, we are doing a series that will showcase powerful Black queer voices within the community. Often, Pride spaces are white-centric. We are either fighting for queer rights or Black rights, but we are never fighting for both. In 2016, when Black Lives Matter stopped the Pride Parade in Toronto, many of my white queer friends suggested that it was not their place to do so. But I know that that's not true, because Black queer people exist. What about the people that sit at the intersection of Black and queer identities? As a white, queer person, I know that I hold power. I am listened to, at the very least, during Pride Month. My experience is not overlooked in conversations about queer and trans rights. So I want to make sure to use my voice to uplift the experiences I do not know. I want to know more about what it means to be Black and queer. I can help by giving the space to have these meaningful conversations. Please enjoy this series of conversations with Black queer folks who are out in the world being authentically Black and queer and proud. Listen, learn, and activate.
Good morning, everyone. My salutations are Mix Matthew Webb. I go by the pronouns they, them, and I'm a supervisory officer with the position of being the Equity and Advisory Officer for the Simcoe County District School Board. And prior to my position at the Simcoe County District School Board, I was the principal of Queen Victoria Public School in the TDSB. And prior to that, I was a principal of several schools in TDSB in Malvern, Kingston Road and Galloway community, and also served as vice principals in that part of Scarborough as well.
So we'll just kind of dive right into it. I want to talk to you first about your identity. How, do you identify as queer?
Yes, I do.
How would you define queer?
Well, it's funny. For me, I define queer as being an individual that cares about, loves, seeking a soulmate of the same gender identity. I say that for me, it's because there have been times, I would be very public on the Zoo, where I've had relationships and almost married females. And I say that for me, being queer is about my sense of identity. It's not based upon the gender identity expression of who I'm with. So in regards to my queerness, I myself am queer. There are times where I met a female and I was very much in love and enamored, but I would still go to gay bars and I would still go and socialize in the gay community because that's who I am.
Interesting. Okay.
So I don't consider myself a pansexual. I don't. Okay. Sorry, I'm hoping that helps.
No, that does help. So seeking the same identity would be like someone who is also queer?
Yes.
Okay, I see. Okay, so it's not necessarily regarding like gender identity. So you're not looking for someone who's maybe non-binary or something.
You got it.
Do you? I should ask because you use mix and they them. Do you identify as non-binary?
It depends on the mood I'm in and the music I'm listening to.
That's fair.
If it's Depeche Mode, anything could go. If it's Morrissey, you never know.
Love that. Okay. So how do your racial identity, how does it intersect with your queerness?
Well, it's funny. I get that asked that all the time. And so my legal birth name is Luke Matthew Nathaniel. My last name legally is Webb Yishavaria. So the reason for that is my mother was born in Jamaica, but she's of Jamaican Cuban heritage with Tayao, which is the indigenous or Arawak people of Jamaica. My father is of Caucasian, British, and also Spanish. And my mother's father, who was born in Cuba, is of Spanish, Afro, Latinx, and African heritage. So in a nutshell, I'm close to 31 flavors.
Just a regular Dr. Pepper over here.
There you go. So that's why I identify myself as Afro-Latinx queer, because I would like to honor my African ancestors and heritage, and genetically, that is what I present publicly. But I do know that my Chevalier side of the family, there's many of us in Canada, in the States, in England, in Spain, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Peru. I want to honor my grandfather's people because it's important that my children who are multiracial, biracial, Jewish, it's important for me to honor where I came from and let them know that in 2022, myself, a child born in the 70s, here in Canada, I'm a person of intersectionality to the power of three.
Do you mind, just because I guess apparently I just found some ignorance in myself, do you mind telling me about, is it Chevaria?
Chevalier, yes.
Okay, do you mind telling me a little bit more about what that means?
Okay, well, Chevalier comes from where my grandfather's family originally is from in Cuba, is in Santiago. Chevalier is a Spanish colonial family name from Catalina in Spain. They came over centuries ago to Cuba as, unfortunately, plantation owners who, of course, as we know the tragic history of Africans or people of African descent in world history, had slaves and had families with slaves. So, and hence, in my grandfather's culture in Cuba, it didn't matter if Senor Chevalier was in the main house with his wife or was with his other significant others on the estate. All the children adopted the last name. So that's why we know. And then I also did a genetic search one day and I ended up finding all these relatives of mine who are now in like third and fifth cousins that are actually in Miami. They're all over the world. And every so often I connect with them on Facebook. And my grandfather, who's Chevalier, and his mother, there was a crisis in Cuba at a particular time in Cuban history. I believe it's the 40s or 30s. And a lot of Afro-Cubans fled Cuba and went to Jamaica, Haiti, Dominica, Mexico. And so my grandfather, who died in Canada at the age of 78 many years ago, had half brothers that he remembers playing with on the estate that were now living in Peru and Panama. And again, due to his age, due to his time in the world, they didn't have internet. They had phone or they had mail. So he used to tell me stories about his half brother Vincento, who actually lived in Mexico. His mother fled with her children by Senor Chevalier during this political social time in Cuba and went to Mexico. And he has fond memories of the two siblings, them as two siblings playing with each other. And so it's interesting teaching my children now at my age about understanding your roots, and that's a part of your identity. That is also part of your gender expression. There are certain aspects of myself now I realize, oh, I now know why I'd be in a club like Chez Moi or Comrades or some other places that probably no longer exist at my age. And, like even the other day I was at the board office and I'm in the lobby and all of a sudden I just hear this wonderful beat and I'm just like moving. And people are, and some of the senior team were like, oh, and I was like, it's Latin, don't you know? It's like, it's Hispanic music. So just, I think instinctively, I always knew I was drawn to certain music and I didn't really know. And then when my grandfather came to Canada in the 80s, 86, 87 to live, I would ask him like, tell me more about Chevalier. And he would explain it to me. And now people understand my eyes are actually dark blue.
Okay.
Yeah, people have come out to me like, do you have cholesterol? No. And I've gotten tested for it. Apparently, part of my Spanish Cuban heritage is I have dark blue eyes. Unless you come close, you don't think they're dark blue until you're like really close to me and you're like, oh. And so I'm learning more about that side of my family. And my mother said, your grandfather had dark blue eyes. So it's just interesting that you learn about those intersectionalities. And I thought, people are telling me I had cholesterol, and the doctor said, no, you don't. So, and then finding out that, yes, my eyes are in fact dark blue.
That's so interesting. That's so cool. And it's so interesting to, see the parts of you, like, even just like kind of the parts that are kind of almost cultural, like, you know what I mean? Like where, gender expression means something different to other people. Like they'll look at you and, think, oh, that's, something that would be considered, feminine or something like that in this particular culture. But then, you're just doing something that comes naturally to you. You know what I mean? It's interesting. That's very interesting.
And I think part of it is that, for the people that are viewing this YouTube, on behalf of Uplift Black, it took a long time for me to be comfortable with who I am as a person. Though I was born and raised in this country, I grew up in a very interesting world of, my mother was a single mother with myself. We grew up in Ontario housing in inner city Scarborough. My dad came from middle upper class, worked for Ontario Hydro. I don't know how they meant to have me, but it happened. But 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 so I came from a person of two worlds. So I think I was always more than my friends when I was living with my mother, because I did have opportunities and experiences. And it also explains my suspension records. So I'd misbehave in public school in Scarborough Board of Education, get kicked out, and then I would go to private school where my dad put me in, and then I would misbehave or be misunderstood. Then I would come back to public school. So my transcript is Scarborough Board of Education and Baby Glen Academy, back and forth, back and forth. And I think part of that had to do with my own development of myself as a queer person. I think I knew I didn't really fit in inner city Scarborough fully. And I knew I didn't fit in middle upper class at Bayview and Lawrence at private school. I knew, but I always thought it was a race thing. And when I reflect back, it wasn't just a race thing. I think I knew instinctively my internal clock was different. I was at a different beat. I think I knew now that I'm in plus whatever age I'm now. But back then, because there was broad anti-homophobic labels, right? I mean, I've been called a lot of vicious names,
Yeah.
ironically enough, in the public school system in Scarborough, overtly, covertly, not so much as in the private school.
Interesting.
But I think that's because I knew my internal clock was different. And I think, instinctively unapologetic about it, not knowing that I should at the time learn how to be on the down low in Scarborough. I didn't have that code education of how to do that.
Yeah, so you were just kind of being authentically yourself before you like realized that maybe you shouldn't necessarily be.
Yes.
And so, well, that's beautiful. That's really cool. I like that.
And I think that's why in this role, I made it a point when I came. I mean, I'm known in TDSB, but I'm not known. Like a lot of people know of my queer identity. I don't soapbox it, but I speak truth. I did one day hope to be an openly queer superintendent in TDSB, but that's a different story for a different day, with the challenges and the barriers and the biases from people in that board, who maligned my reputation unwarranted. But it's okay, because that journey led to coming to Simcoe where I live. And that journey led to me recognizing that, one, I will never treat any employee or person the way I've seen be treated in my previous work experience, and or by leadership. And so coming to this board, I made a clear intention of being authentically myself and unapologetically me. I went up to Georgian Bay a couple of weeks ago. One of my passions is environmental racism. It's one of my many areas that I have degrees and or certificates in. And I was invited by the principal to come up there because she's learned about my work in environmental education and science. And I've spoken at OISE for a couple of their conferences. I've spoken at ECOM last year about environmental racism and how race impacts urban planning, impacts health services long before it came to the forefront in COVID. It was my thing. I was known for it. I don't have a PhD in it. I don't have a master's in it, but I was always passionate about being an environmental racist advocate. And I look at trends and patterns, and I look at poverty, and I look at the intersectionality between that and geography and social services and urban planning. And so I say that because, this principal and her staff or students recognized that, invited me up for Earth Day. I worked with the grade 9, 10s, and 11 classes about educating them about the fundamentals of how social advocacy work, queerness, and environmental racism are very much entwined. When you look about the communities in Canada specifically, because the United States is a little bit differently, mm-hmm. The queer community has started up in communities that were considered impoverished, like Parkdale, even Church Street at one time. No one wanted to live on Church Street back in the day. There are areas in Vancouver that are now urban oases of, wow, it's chic and cool. It's the gay community. but it was the gay community that went into those communities because no one wanted to live there, and became and created a home and created an environment and created a culture that was then, I would say, mediafied to be glitz and glamourish 20 years later.
Yeah.
So I talk about those intersectionalities in my work of environmental racism. And so a student came to me at the end and was speaking to me and said, Mixed Web, and I'll also say student A. And I said, sure, student A, how's it going? I appreciate you coming, speaking to the class here, to all the classes at GBDS, and great to have you here. And the person said to me, it's fantastic to have a queer person on senior team in this board. And I said, what do you mean? And the student said, I searched you up. I Googled you. I said, oh, okay. Lovely, lovely student. And I said to the student, if you need me on here, just go through your principal, because again, my role, you're a student, and I didn't know their age. But that made me feel good. And I remember coming back to Director Dance and saying, this scenario happened. Of course, I didn't name the student, but I said, just myself having the Human Rights and Equity Advisor and Employment Equity role in this board, this student in Midland saw me at the senior table as, it's okay, like you are you and you're there. And I thought, wow, like that is what I strive for in this board.
That's awesome. That's beautiful.
Sorry.
No, that's good. Yeah. I feel similar ways in that, like, students will identify with me and be like, I'm so glad that you're here and things like that. And I'm wondering, because I don't know that I found my way to teaching because of that, but I'm wondering if you kind of found your way to education because of your queerness, or how did you find your way to education is maybe a better question.
So I always wanted to be a teacher, and I went to a school in Scarborough called Robert Service Middle School. One of the few times I was in public school for a longer period of time in my back and forth career in education, public versus private. And we had a music teacher. And for those of you that grew up with me in Scarborough and may see me in this video, he was our grade 7 and 8 music teacher named Mr. Clement. And I knew Mr. Clement was different. And he's one of the few staff members, never talked about a wife, just very passionate. He was our teacher librarian in our music. And I knew he was different. And when I reflect back, that was a moment. I mean, he didn't, at the time, it was Scarborough Board. It was the 80s. You didn't really, if you were a queer educator, you didn't really come out. But I just knew. I guess that my gaydar, as they say, was active in middle schools. I knew he was, right? Or sensed he could be. And he just introduced us to, in very subtle ways, through his role as teacher librarian, to different authors of different identities and intersectionalities, even before it became as big as it was today. And he just had a kindness about him. And I also had educators that were not part of what I would call the rainbow spectrum, but made every intention and opportunities to discuss aspects of that into teaching and learning. I had a great English teacher who happened to be the phys ed teacher of the same middle school. And at the time, we read a book, some of us read a book study called Fifth Business. And his name was Mr. Howell, fantastic man. And you would think alpha jock, to my knowledge, heterosexual. But I remember we were talking about the character of Lizelle in the book. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but Lizelle has a very unique sexual identity. And I encourage all of you, Fifth Business was the book that changed my life and made me really think about gender identity, relationships, expression, and identity, just through the character of Lizelle and the character of Paul Dempster or Isengrim, Magnus Isengrim. That's what he later became in book 3. And that made me realize back then when Robertson Davies, Caucasian man of middle-class privileged lived experience, was able to write this book back in the 70s and 60s and had a good understanding of making some prominent characters have these fluid identities. And I thought, wow. And so Mr. Howell talked about Lizelle. And again, we didn't have the vocabulary we have today in terms of gender identity and expression, not as in-depth vocabulary and understanding. But he kind of got it back then. And he woven that novel into the health unit at the time, where you didn't talk about sexual identity. Sorry, Ministry of Education. That's a throw out there. A different time, different place. But that also was another person that inspired me to become a teacher. And I thought, as I developed and grew, I wanted to be an educator that impact the lives of kids in a positive way. And I always use literature to teach up, not teach down. So when I became a teacher over the years, and I was at my last school before I became a central teacher for Toronto Board, I used to introduce books like The Chrysalids and talked about the metamorphosis of identity and being. I used to bring in books, Fifth Business. I used to talk about the complexity of The Great Gatsby. Was Daisy's cousin really gay or was he not? And I would just so those things. And that was a class that I thought I really infused aspects of my identity. I mean, I never gave specifics, but I never hit anything because I was always trying to watch that boundary as an educator. How much is too much? I don't want to be brought to OCT by saying you're spilling your entire life to your class, but I also wanted to be authentic, to be a role model to those in the class who were struggling with identity or struggling to find a like-minded person who was going through similar challenges or who had experienced similar challenges. So I went into teaching because of that, but I had careers before teaching. I was a social worker. I was an addictions counselor. I was a recreationist in Parkdale. I was a corporate communications person with CBC. I had many lived experiences prior to teaching.
Wow.
Which I think is what complicated a lot of my development and growth as an employee in the Toronto Board, because I didn't follow the traditional trajectory.
That's fair.
I came in already knowing how to manage people in larger teams, more complex teams for my different careers. But I always had a passion to give back to community, like my mother does in Scarborough. She volunteers all the time for the police services, for different churches, for Juliet's Place, for Taibu. And it's always been ingrained in the Cheveria side of the family that we've always given back to community.
What a way to come into it. I love that you've had so many different experiences before you came into this as well. So with regard to it being kind of a book that was representation, it seems like that, obviously based on what you were saying, that there wasn't a lot of visible representation of maybe who you are as an educator. So the 80s, growing up at that time, was obviously different than it is now. How do you perceive that difference? Is there what was it like maybe growing up in the 80s?
Again, Christopher, this was the time again of HIV and AIDS, and this is the time of a lot of individuals living life on the down low. It was so hard growing up in the 80s. Then you add HIV, which further stigma the community, especially if you're a male, because the media spin on it, from the blood bank scandals to everything, the queer community was being blamed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it was very hard there were many of us in Scarborough that were Black, Latino, even Greek, some Greek friends of mine, growing up in our areas of Scarborough, Malvern, and Agincourt, that we had to be on the down low. There was no community in Scarborough because you were afraid of being outed. Most of us became more comfortable in our identities when we went to college and university, where, to coin the phrase in a whimsical way, when you're engaging in liberal arts. And I think the word liberal really helped us to be, there's the homo hop at U of T. Oh, there's queer night at York. Oh, there's, I forgot the name of the night at Glendon College. Oh, there was Centennial in Scarborough. So that allowed us a safe space to interact with others and meet others. And of course, for me at the time, being a club dancer, Electric Circus I was on as a dancer, and other TV shows and clubs, the warehouse party scene really, when it first came to Toronto, stories I could tell you there. Well, I just really created a space, especially for Afro, Latino, Portuguese, Hispanic, Filipino, Asian, all along Spadina and King and Queen. And every time I go downtown that area, I tell my children, oh, I used to dance at that club upstairs, which is now Winners. Oh, I used to be over here. Oh, Cameron House is gone.
Yeah.
And so there was an aura in the 80s that you could be who you are after hours in the warehouse district. So a lot of young queer individuals, and when I say queer, I should put the caveat that to those in our community who identify as lesbian, please know I'm including you in that, because sometimes the term queer has been co-opted by the males. So I just want to honor that when I say that. But it allowed us those opportunities to really be who we are and just enjoy the love of music. And it wasn't even about dating or meeting people. It was about the love of people that loved house music. Those were the early days of the ballroom scene in Toronto. Like when I hear about the ballroom scene now and the people that are running them, I'm like, no, like we used to like leave Colby's or Comrades, again, I'm dating myself, or Remingtons. And we would dart over to, we would all pack in different cabs. There was one night, like we all packed, like 8 of us packed into a Beck taxi cab, and we drove all the way over to, and we called it at the time, the term we used was fare splitting, right? 8 of us becomes less money. Cheaper than TTC. Note to self, TTC. There's a better way. So you haven't seen the whimsical side of me. See, you have to work with me on a regular basis. God bless my executive assistant. And so that being said, those are the first earlier balls. But we didn't. The Toronto scene was very different than the New York and Chicago scenes. So we didn't officially call them balls. And I mean, when I see legendary, I'm like, please, like try to do legendary with barely any high glitz lights and the world of La Roach and Jamila. We had like, sometimes Michelle Ross would go by some of the warehouse parties on her way after she performed. Or she would go to one gig and come back, and there was so many wonderful people that have now passed that there was a ballroom scene long before ballroom was ballroom in the city. Yeah. So the warehouse parties were that atmosphere. And then again, before TTC had 24-hour bus service, we all had to quickly rush to the St. Patrick's subway station or museum because we all had to sneak back home before our parents woke up. So we all had to grab the very first subway trains, the 608 train, Yonge University line, to get up to Finch to grab our buses to get back. So it was very interesting. I think back then, the queer individuals who are my age, we were so good with time management because we had to like leave our houses in Rexdale, Scarborough, North York, where limited bus was running, get downtown to enter the clubs, then to get to the warehouse parties, but to get back, hopefully our parents were still sleeping. It was the art of time management.
Yeah, it really builds some time management skills. It certainly does.
It did.
That's wonderful. It's actually really cool because I've, only started kind of hearing that Toronto had a ballroom scene. And I mean, I never doubted that it did. But it's really interesting to hear about how it existed at kind of the same time, possibly, New York City, and it had like a different flavor to it because Toronto does have a different flavor than New York City. So it's interesting. That's cool.
Yeah, well, it's funny because again, when I look at my friend Black Cat now and all the stuff he's doing and all his friends that were up and coming DJs that are like doing tons of stuff all over the world, I remember us slugging Black Cat's music stuff from his parents' garage. For those of you that don't know, he is a graduate of Mary Shand Public School in Malvern, just for the record, and just putting in the back of his car our cars when we had cars and lugging them down for him. Again, we were such a great sense of community because we were kind of helping each other out. And when I see his name on posters and all over the world, I'm like, his DJ career started from the warehouse party scenes because the gay bars wouldn't let him play. There's a few at the time, we didn't use the term transgender, but there was a few Vogue femme individuals that were DJs too. And the traditional clubs in Toronto, gay clubs, would never let them DJ until they experienced the notoriety in the warehouse scene. Then that's how they got their foot in the doors in major straight and gay bars. So again, when I hear the story of Jackie Shane, I don't know if you know of Jackie Shane.
I don't, if you don't mind telling.
Jackie Shane is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful performing artist. Again, prior to our understanding of the vocabulary transgendered, was a male to female. Some of her biography reads as impersonator, but she was not an impersonator. She was authentically herself. She came from the States and sang in some wonderful jazz clubs and bars in Toronto. And it's Jackie, last name Shane. Phenomenal individual, and was a pioneer in the 50s and 60s. And she died, I think it was 2 years ago in Toronto. No, it was in the States she died. She went back to the States and talked about what a welcoming haven Toronto was for Blacks that left the States who were gay or queer, and just a phenomenal voice and music career. So if you Google her, lots of YouTube videos,
I'm
people
going
have put her songs onto YouTube. But again, a pioneer in a time when being Black and gay and going through the process of transitioning to female and set their career. And what I love about the Jackie Shane story is the one thing everyone had in common: exceptional voice, exceptional voice. And there's a lot of articles about her in the Toronto Star Historical Archives about her artistry in Toronto, and just people did not know that she was born a male.
That's so interesting. Okay. Okay. At the time, so you were kind of growing up and you mentioned that you had to kind of get home before your parents noticed.
Yeah.
Was there a reason kind of about like that you don't want your parents kind of to notice, or was it like, in some households it's not easy to be who you are? And so I'm wondering how was growing up for you with regard to family?
So to be frank with you, as I said, like I never came out to my family in my youth because
Okay.
again, there was that fear of the stigmatization of the Black church. Now
Right.
there is Elliot Page, and I believe I forgot
Yeah.
the name of her friend. They did that series about looking at gay in different cultures, and one of the segments they did, if you haven't seen it, you should. It's very enlightening. And I don't know if it's like I don't know if it was a vacation series, but it was a series where she and her friend, or they and their friend, I apologize, Elliot. They and their friend visited Jamaica as one of the segments, and they met a self-identified lesbian and talked about the struggles of being gay in Jamaica. And it's relatively recent, like I think it was like 2010 or 2012 it came out. And what a lot of people don't understand is within West Indian culture, and I'm talking about the non-Latin X culture, so I'm talking about the Afro-West Indian culture, religion is still a backbone. It's still the moral fabric of my mother's generation of parenting and family structure and culture. And because if they grew up and were born in Jamaica and didn't leave Jamaica until their 20s, they still adopted, like my mother, they still adopted some of those values. I love my mother. She loves me, accepts me who I am. She loves my children. She loves my spouse. All is good. But it was hard in the 80s because, again, you're a minor, you are a Black male, you're going to church with your mother every week, and you're hearing. Now, my church, they never ever preached anything derogatory about homophobia, but it never came up. We did have, I learned many years later, we did have a deacon that was very well respected, well renowned, and unfortunately, he passed on from AIDS. But I didn't know about his story until like 30 years later. I was an adult already living on my own. But I understood that many people in the church knew. So I think there was a quiet acceptance of it, as long as it was not a in your face, right?
Okay.
Because when I asked my mother one day, oh, what happened to Deacon such and such? And she said, oh, he had died. And she explained to me how. But it was never like my mother primarily was never afraid of me because I was responsible. And I was always a responsible person. I mean, as much as I was sneaking in at 7 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, right? I wasn't bringing people with me. So, right. And she kind of knew who some of my friends were, and some of them now she looks back and she was like, was that person gay? Was that person not? Or, but she accepted my friends for who they were anyways. But I always had a wide range of racially diverse friends because my mother, when she came to Canada, she had come to study to become a nurse, but due to, again, that's another YouTube talk about racism, the Black community, and the health industry in the 60s. There was a lot of professionally trained nurses in Jamaica that came here. And I'm going to put it out there, Sunnybrook, because this is the story of Sunnybrook. Some of these individuals tried to get jobs and were delegated to house cleaning jobs at some of our most significant hospitals to this day.
Oh,
and
goodness.
due to racism. So that's another segment for another day.
Yikes.
My mother was one of those. So she had to enter the nursing aid field. She eventually translated into the educational field when she married my stepfather, had my younger siblings. But I'm giving you this context because of her experiences working with different diverse peoples. And again, when she was a nurse's aide, she worked with, at the time, the beginning of the aging population of the gay community. So she had clients that she supported that didn't have HIV or anything like that, but they were just gay and aging, which was, again, on the cusp of what we are now experiencing today, where we have a large gay and aging community. And with that, in 2022, they also have spouses and or kids. So this is back in a time when single gay men had no medical ailments. They were just aging. my mother was in home supporting them with basic things and etc. So she had a lens about the gay community, even based upon her background. She had a level of acceptance, and plus the diversity of racial diversity of whom she worked with and religious diversity. So when I came to be who I am and accepted who I am, it was nothing more but just a loving thing. I was never told, shh, don't say anything. I was never told, when my friends around act this way, it's just, I'm here for you. And she's always been that way, you know. And when I had my kids, same thing. She's just fantastic grandmother and just overall great person.
That's beautiful. Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. That is good.
She talks to my spouse more than she talks to me because she loves my spouse. Yeah.
I feel like that's like a common thing in queer couples. It's like the parents love the spouse even more.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
Yeah. She'll talk about our son with him, not with me. Yeah.
That's
and I'm her son. Yeah.
Of course. Okay, so moving forward a little bit, I wanted to know kind of a little bit of maybe the difference in communities, like coming to Simcoe County. How have you experienced queerness, and how have you experienced like your racial identity being offered?
It's interesting because I moved to Simcoe County within the last 4.5 years. I have still yet trying to figure out what's happening in the queer community here. Like, I'm a volleyballer, I'm a badminton person, I'm, recreational basketball person. Don't ever put me on the ice. Don't ever put me on the golf course, because comedy will begin. But I can play them, but I'm not committed to those things.
That's fair.
So I haven't found the gay sports groups I'm used to out and out in Toronto, where there's so many sports organizations. So because I worked for Toronto Board for 20 something odd years, even though when I moved up here for half that 4.5 years, I was still a principal in Toronto. So I would go to Spartans volleyball on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I would still go to out and out basketball after work, and then come home to Simcoe County like at 1 o'clock in the morning, because by the time everything finished, I showered, drove home, it was 1 o'clock. So I haven't found my footing in the gay community here yet, because I'm still new. But also, to be frank with you, Christopher, it's just like with UPlift Black or Parents Against Racism Simcoe County. I'm not a person that pushes myself into organizations and groups. I'm the kind of person, if you see me on TV or you see me in a newscast or you see me in a building or a school or a library, I would like to be invited in, not out of a sense of arrogance, but as a sense of, because you're comfortable in inviting me into your space. Mm-hmm. So I am waiting to be invited into the queer community space. I'm waiting to be invited into the Parents Against Racism Simcoe County space. I'm waiting to be invited into UPlift Black space and other Latino community. I'm waiting to be invited, because I do recognize that with my role in the school board, that I need community to trust me on their terms and let me in on their terms. I am not going to insert myself in terms of that. And I would like to respect privacy and identity of all members in all of those community groups. So I'm willing to be supportive. I'm willing to come in on community's terms. So that's why, same thing with the gay community, I'm willing to be invited in on their terms.
That's fair. Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, being in a certain position, it can complicate things for sure. So when you use the term, like the honorific mix, and use they, them pronouns, you don't necessarily identify as non-binary, maybe sometimes, maybe not, maybe we're not sure. I'm wondering, is that part of your identity a political identity, or does it have to do with because you're kind of coming to terms with your gender identity? Like, what does it like, how did you come to choose using they, them pronouns, and how did you come to choose using mix?
So funny enough, it was a senior person in TDSB that made me choose those pronouns, because they were trying to be respectful, and I was in a story or something in Toronto Board 2 schools ago, and the person sort of said to me, like, when did you decide? like as if, like, okay, like today I woke up and I decided to be gay, tomorrow I decided to be bi. So I was like, when did I decide? Okay, and you're in a position of leadership, okay, so let me roll with this. So I really chose mix and they them because I don't think it's none of your damn business to ask me. but I do want to be respected.
Yeah. I love that.
So having they then prevents people asking me, are you gay? Are you straight? Are you bi? I was like, get the hell out of my face.
Yeah, I love that. Honestly, I really do love that, because like gender is kind of, to me, it's becoming so, it's not complicated, but now that I have come to terms with who I am and like knowing that I am non-binary, and it also like first I came to terms with my sexuality, then I came to terms with my gender identity, and now I'm like, okay, now I have to go back to my sexuality because what does it mean that I'm non-binary and I'm attracted to, like, who am I attracted to now, and am I attracted to, you know, do you know what I mean by that?
Yes, I get you. Yeah. And also too, I felt this, and I did that change particularly when I left one school in Scarborough, Agnes MacPhail, and I became principal of Queen Victoria in Parkdale. Because I was a recreationist at Miseric Cowan Community Center for many years, I did addictions counseling in Parkdale. I was always who I was in Parkdale. Like I wasn't straight. I was just Matt, right? And because, you know, back in the day, some people that are now parents knew me from the club scene, some lesbian parents and some gay parents. So I made the conscious decision that when I was honored and asked by the TDSB to take over Queen Vic after the anti-Black racism incidences and to instill community trust or rebuild community trust, shift professional learning for staff, address anti-Black racism, address homophobia in the building, transphobia, re-engage the Tibetan community, rebuild confidence within the Hungarian community. I remembered, because I used to live in Parkdale too, I used to live on Sororan Avenue with my boys when I was a single dad. And I thought, I'm going to go back into Parkdale and I'm going to go by they, them intentionally. On my business cards, my emails, I started using mix. And again, those subtle moves. I had LGBTQ students, I had two S students and their parents be thankful that I did that and said, like, you're the first principal in TDSB to actually be themselves in that manner, very transparent on their business cards, on their email signatures, even when asking how to be greeted. And that really built public confidence in the equity work I was doing in those spaces during very difficult and challenging times with a disenfranchised staff, a staff that was fractured, community very critical of the school and the school board and their commitment to anti-Black racism. And knowing that there were members of the Black community who are also identify with the rainbow community, it was important to them when I first started and I was doing that, because it was a sign of my work and the sign that the work was going to start and be underway. I left to come to Simcoe and it was a great decision to come to Simcoe. But, you know, I still have parents and staff reach out to me, not to give me adulations, but to say, thank you for getting the work started. Thank you for, you know, my son has seen a Afro-Latino queer principal, and my son is part Indigenous and part something else, or part Anglo, or my child has a queer identity and was happy that you, the very first openly queer principal in that part of Toronto board, meant a lot. So I did that intentionally, knowing that, looking at the student demographics before I took over the school and recognizing that there was a significant queer student population, I wanted to honor them. And again, this is who I am now, and I'm here. A lot of pain, a lot of challenge, a lot of struggles. But if I can be here, you have my support to follow your dreams.
That's beautiful. And, you know, I mean, even just with like recent statistics coming out with SCDSB and seeing that like 23% of the kids are queer, and it's possibly even more than that because that was a self-identification thing and some might not feel comfortable doing that, right?
Yes.
Representation is really important and it's underestimated, but even just something as simple as going by mix and just, you know, doing something like in the hallways, you're kind of like stopped by people and they're like, what is MX? How do I say that? And I'm like, oh, you know, this, and it's just starting those conversations that really helps to get people kind of thinking that like it's not just kids, it's not just a phase, it's not just something that's, you know, going to pass by, right?
Yes. And it's interesting because being who I am and the role and the positionality I hold on the board, you know, I remembered fondly that I was reached out about a situation, and it really touched my heart in the sense of a colleague reached out to me about experiencing transphobia, homophobia in the workplace by a senior team person. And, I was very impressed that the person was strong enough to bring it to me. Now, I wasn't in a senior role at this time. And I'm telling you this story because it's going to lead to something that you sort of mentioned, Christopher, about the students and the demographics. So through another colleague, we got connected and I heard this scenario. And it wasn't a good scenario, but I took the opportunity with the position I had as the Central Principal of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Simcoe County to do intentional learning with senior team about engaging staff and community who identify within the rainbow community. It's important that we hear from the field. It's important we hear from the staff. It's important we hear from the kids. It's important we hear from our parents, that we are mindful of how we engage them, whether our engagement is intentional, like I'm talking about the negative impacts, is intentional or non-intentional. So I did have a sit down with 1 and 2 specific individuals to say, when you are in spaces, it's so important to check your bias on perception, and educating the senior team. Again, not that the senior team needed in-depth education, but just bringing more awareness that individuals have very fluid identities that can present themselves in different ways in different spaces and places. And so we need to be mindful with our language. If we're a board that's promoting inclusive language, that starts from the top.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Starts from the top. And so having that and sitting down with the senior team in my previous role as Principal of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Simcoe, and recognizing the percentage of students who identify as different gender expression and identity groups within the rainbow community, is how I pitched the first graduation coach for LGBTQIA plus students. It's because I was able to show, this is what your staff census is saying, this is what your equity audit is saying, this is what your student census is saying. And instead of us wait for one of the larger boards to do this, let us, and it's not about tooting ourselves on our shoulder. We have evidence that we have a significant student population that needs support. And this is before my experience at Georgian Bay District School. And I think to myself, if I was a child in Collingwood, I'm a child in Angus, I'm a child in North Aurelia, and you don't have the urban context of being in Barrie, and I'm struggling to get support, get access, my identity and gender expression may be known in my local school or community school, it may not be. Who advocates for me? And so I pitched the idea to our director and our associate director and the superintendent of equity. And I'm saying this not to give adulations or say, oh, they're superheroes, but they listened. And based upon my capacity, articulation, said, yeah, we need to do right by kids. And our data shows we have a significant community and we need to do right by this community. And we're not going to wait for the ministry to direct school boards to have this coaching role. Let's be the first and create it.
Absolutely.
And I get emails and calls from other boards to say, I read the article in some paper saying you're the first board to have this. Let us know how it goes. Let us know how it's rolling out. So change is coming to Simcoe board. It's
awesome.
coming.
That's
it's
good.
coming.
It's coming. To see it.
It's these little steps in this role of Afro-Latinx queerness that I can bring these with a lens of, it's a creative way, a different way, but more importantly, a new way to support. And when I say underserved, please note in this video, I don't mean poverty. I mean groups that due to population, like they're not a significant population is what I mean by underserved. Their needs are not being met because they are a small populous group. So when I mean underserved in this video, I'm not referring to poverty. I'm not referring to linguistical challenge. Sometimes if you're only 3 people in a board that has the identity of Afro, Latinx, and queer, it's hard to have your needs served because you're only a populace of 3.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean underserved. I mean, I'm referring to populous numbers.
Fair. Okay, so just a couple more questions. I want to know, just like even just kind of like as a tangent off of the last one, what is your vision for Simcoe County or Simcoe County District School Board? Like, what do you want to see in the future?
Oh Lord, a couple of things. I would like to really work hard in my current role as Human Rights and Equity Advisor with other roles, both senior team and non-senior team, to how do we encourage diversity on different levels to come join us, work with us, motivate change, and inspire our students. So how do I get more queer folk to go into leadership? How do I get more racialized folk to come up here and become teachers? How do I get more underserved groups in positions in this board that you don't see that representation? And when I say that, and I've been criticized for that within community in this board, I would rather have the best qualified racialized or queer student in front of students or teacher in front of students than just have the person because of their identity. Because if I put the worst person,
Yeah.
that's not a good role modeling. So I'm seeking to find that combination.
Yeah. And that can be complicated.
And another thing I'd like to see in this board in the future, whether it happens in my lifetime or not, is with our growing demographics, I would love to see more and more senior team reflect the growing racial, religious, gender identity and expression in different management and senior management levels of this board.
It'd be beautiful. Oh, that's a beautiful vision. I love that. I love that. I'm here for it. Okay. One more question.
Sure.
What does queer joy look like to you?
After hours or because queer joy looks for me after hours is the Canadian version of La Roche.
I love that.
Well, queer joy for me is I would love to see a more vibrant queer community within Barrie. Maybe not a Castro Street, maybe not a Church Street, but even a cluster hub of stores somewhere that, one is maybe a bookstore, one is a restaurant that is an after hours club, one that is, a social place for queer parents and their kids. So that's the challenging part with our district, is that we're so geographically large, but we don't have even a mini hub.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see that would be my queer joy. Like I said to a queer administrator in our district the other day, we had coffee, and I said to them, it'd be nice that even our district had a once a month queer event, whether it's a book reading, whether or not we invite Call Me Julius to speak to us, but it's one where it didn't matter what your role was in the board, but it was just and I'm not going to say safe space or brave space, but just a cultural space where we queer folk who work for the board can just not complain about the board, but let's talk about what's happening in our communities. Let's talk about, hey, you know what? There's a great art gallery being opened by an up and coming queer artist, like sort of like a queer cultural center, so that we hear and connect with each other about great queer happenings in Simcoe County, and have a place where we can share and learn about those things, and have a place where we can, similar to UPlift Black's vision that Shelley mentioned at the event a couple of weeks ago about enhancing performance. I would love to see even UPlift Black own an old school or community center that is their center, where all of this magic can happen for not just Black community, but even the queer community.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's beautiful. I want that too. We're going to do it. Okay, so usually at the end, we just want to give you any time or a little bit of time just to say anything that you feel like was missed, or anything that you wanted to talk about, or anything like that. Do you have anything that you would like to share?
I think in the world of advocacy, Christopher, is this. We're in a very delicate time where community groups want to bring issues to the forefront. Support that completely. Call us out, call us in. The challenging part of my last parting words is how we do it. We want to educate, but not shame and blame. We want to inspire and motivate others to shift practice and thinking from their traditional thoughts and actions to proactive and inclusive. And my parting thoughts to anyone watching this video is that whether you're advocacy groups or whether or not you are in the field and uncertain, may have fragility, it all starts from respectful conversation. If you're coming to the table with, we, the advocacy group, is educating you that this is wrong based upon the facts that we have, the folks in the field, educators, social workers, whatever you are in public and Catholic education, approach the conversation as not, I'm going to be shamed and blamed in social media, but help me understand what I can do better so that I can support the concerns or shift the concerns that you are bringing to me. And I think in the world since 2020, everyone wants to have a say, everyone wants to be defensive, but we're not doing what I call active listening. And I think it also starts from proactive learning. When issues are coming from community, we have to teach the students and the staff who did wrong what they did wrong. And we give them a chance to correct and learn. If they repeat after that, then that's a different ball of wax.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to find that balance where community has voice, brings concerns in a respectful manner, but public service has to own a mistake has been made and has to say, we are the public service. We have an obligation to learn and to change and to grow and to implement our new learning to do better for kids and engage community. So, parting thoughts.
I love that. Thank you for those parting thoughts. Those are beautiful. Also, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been wonderful. It's been a beautiful conversation. I've had a great time and I've learned a lot, actually. And I appreciate it. We appreciate it, UPlift Black. Thank you.
And to all of you out there, Christopher and Uplifters and everyone in Simcoe County, happy Pride. It's been a long journey. We have that yellow brick road still to go till we reach Oz. But every year, every challenge, every experience, wearing those red ruby slippers, we're going to get to Oz on that yellow brick road.
Yes. Yes, we will. Thank you so much.
Take care. All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.